The way my father's business partner looked at me across that dinner table, I'll never forget it. He tilted his head, set down his fork, and said very quietly, "Wait, you're the one who saved the Hartwell account." The entire table went still. My mother's hand froze halfway to her wineglass. My sister stopped mid-law. And my father, the man who had introduced me 20 minutes earlier as our other daughter, the one who sells things on the internet, stared at his plate like he was reading something written in the grain of the wood. I gave the partner, a man named Leonard, a small, steady smile. Just barely there. And I said nothing. Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. I am the older daughter. My sister Camille is 3 years younger, and from the time she could talk in full sentences, she was the one my parents pointed at when someone asked, "So which one is the success?" She went to a good school, got a marketing degree, landed a job at a mid-sized consulting firm in Chicago. My parents came to her graduation. They rented a hotel room for the weekend. My mother cried happy tears in the parking lot of the auditorium. I graduated 2 years earlier on a Tuesday in May from the same state university. My parents sent a card with a $20 bill inside it. They couldn't make the drive, they said. My dad had a thing with his back. My mother said she'd been fighting a cold. I told myself it was fine. I was 22 with a business administration degree and a laptop I'd bought with money saved from 3 years of waitressing. I started small, sourcing discounted merchandise from liquidation pallets, cleaning it up, reselling it on eBay and then Amazon. My apartment was a one-bedroom in a suburb of Columbus, and for about 14 months the living room was a warehouse. Boxes stacked to the ceiling, a label printer on the kitchen table. I ate standing up most nights because there was no room to sit anywhere. My mother came to visit once during that period. She stood in the doorway, looked around at the boxes, and said, "Sweetheart, this is no way to live." Then she asked if I'd thought about going back to school for something more practical. Nursing, maybe, or dental hygiene. I said I was working on something. She patted my hand and changed the subject to Camille, who had just gotten promoted to senior associate and was dating someone whose family owned a boat. The thing about building something from nothing is that it's invisible for a long time. Nobody sees the spreadsheets. Nobody sees the 4 a.m. mornings when you're recalculating shipping margins to figure out if you can afford to pay yourself that week. Nobody sees the moment you realize you've accidentally built a system that works, that the thing you've been doing quietly, in a one-bedroom apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes, has become something real. By the time I was 27, I had a small warehouse space I was renting in a business park outside Columbus. I had 2 part-time employees. I was doing about $400,000 in annual revenue, which sounds like a lot until you understand that e-commerce margins are thin and every dollar gets turned back into inventory. By the time I was 30, I had 3 warehouses, 12 employees, and a logistics contract with a regional grocery chain that changed everything. The grocery contract alone was worth more per year than my father had earned in the last 5 years of his career before he retired. I did not tell my family any of this. Not because I was hiding it exactly, more because no one ever asked. Holidays, I came home, sat at the table and listened. Camille talked about her promotions, her apartment in Lincoln Park, the guy she was seeing who'd gone to Northwestern. My parents asked her follow-up questions. They laughed at her stories. They leaned forward when she spoke. When my turn came, someone would say, "And how's your little online selling thing going?" And I'd say, "Fine," and the conversation would move on in under 90 seconds. My mother once referred to it as my eBay hobby at her book club, and I found out through a cousin who thought it was funny. I told myself it didn't matter. I was busy, I had work to do. Then my father turned 65, and my mother decided they needed to throw a dinner party. Not a family dinner, a dinner party. With the neighbors, and 2 couples they'd been friends with since the 80s, and my father's old colleague Leonard, who had been his supervisor for the last decade of his corporate career, and who my parents treated with a particular kind of reverence usually reserved for people who can get you into a restaurant without a reservation. Camille was coming with her new boyfriend, a man named Patrick who worked in private equity and had the kind of jaw that suggested he'd played lacrosse in college and had never quite gotten over it. I drove 3 hours from Columbus. I wore a blazer. I brought a bottle of Bordeaux that cost more than I usually admitted to spending on wine, because I knew my father's friends would look at the label. I should have known how the evening would go from the moment I walked through the door. My mother was in the kitchen and she looked up and said, "Oh good, you're here. Can you take those coats from the Hendersons? They're in the entryway." Not hello, not how was the drive. Just a direction, the same way you'd speak to a catering assistant. I took the coats. Camille arrived 20 minutes later with Patrick, and there were actual exclamations from the living room. My mother laughed at something Patrick said within 30 seconds. My father shook his hand with both hands. At dinner, my parents' formal dining table extended with a leaf to fit 10 people. The seatings put me at the far end near the kitchen, next to my Aunt Sylvia, who is 81 years old and mostly talks about her hip replacement and a soap opera she's been watching since 1987. I love Aunt Sylvia. I did not want to be seated next to her at this particular dinner. Leonard was at the other end of the table to my father's right. He was in his early 70s, silver-haired, the kind of man who wore a good watch without drawing attention to it. He'd spent his career in supply chain management for a consumer packaged goods company, one of the big ones, the kind with brands you see in every grocery store in America. At some point early in the dinner, someone asked my parents to introduce everyone, the way you do at parties where not all the guests know each other. My mother went around the table. "This is Leonard, Ted's former supervisor. He's practically family." Warm smile. "This is our daughter Camille. She's in consulting in Chicago. Brilliant girl. Just got promoted again." Beaming. "And this is Patrick, her boyfriend. He works in finance." Approving nod. "And this is our other daughter. She sells things online. Little e-commerce business." She moved on before the sentence was finished. "Not my name, not what I actually do. Just sells things online." Delivered in the same cheerful throwaway tone you'd use to say, she collects stamps or she does those paint-by numbers. Patrick laughed politely, because that's what Patrick did. Camille looked at her salad. Aunt Sylvia asked me if I'd tried the new hip flexor exercises her physical therapist recommended. Leonard looked at me for a moment, that quiet, evaluating look that people in operations develop, like they're assessing whether a process is running efficiently, and then the conversation moved on. The dinner went the way those dinners always go. Camille talked, Patrick talked. My father told a story about his golf game. My mother refilled glasses and accepted compliments on the chicken. I ate. I asked Aunt Sylvia about the soap opera. I answered the questions I was asked, which were few. Somewhere around the second course, I heard my mother telling Leonard about how Camille was up for a partnership track consideration at her firm. And wasn't that something? And Leonard agreed it was something, and then my mother said, "We always knew Camille would do great things." And nobody finished that sentence in any way that included me, but everybody at that end of the table understood what it meant. I picked up my wine glass. I set it down. I looked at the fleur-de-lis pattern on my mother's good china and thought about the Hartwell account. Here's the thing about the Hartwell account. 8 months before this dinner, I'd been in the middle of scaling up the grocery logistics contract when I got a call from a broker I worked with named Garrett. Garrett did sourcing for mid-sized consumer goods companies, and he had a client, a regional grocery chain called Hartwell Family Markets, 17 stores across Ohio and Indiana, that was in trouble. Their primary fulfillment partner had gone under suddenly, bankruptcy proceedings, and they needed someone who could absorb about 40% of their distribution volume within 6 weeks, or they were going to start having empty shelves. That is a very specific kind of crisis. And I happened to be in a position, just barely, and not without risk, to solve it. I won't pretend it was easy. We ran 3 shifts for the first month. I personally slept in the warehouse twice when the overnight supervisor had a family emergency and I couldn't reach anyone. I called in every relationship I'd built over 8 years of doing this work, pulled in a temporary staffing agency I'd never used before, and renegotiated 2 of my own supply agreements to free up capacity. But we did it. Hartwell's shelves stayed stocked. The account was saved. The reason I thought about it at that dinner table was that Hartwell Family Markets, the company that Garrett had brought to me in crisis, the company whose account I'd held together with logistics and sleeplessness and sheer organizational willpower, was one of the largest regional grocery accounts managed by Leonard's former company. I didn't know that when I took the contract. I found out 6 weeks in when their regional VP sent over paperwork and I recognized the parent company name. Leonard didn't know I was connected to it at all. Why would he? He'd retired. He only knew it as a piece of news in the industry, that some fulfillment partner had gone under, and someone had stepped in and kept the chain running. I had not planned for any of what happened next. After the main course, my mother started telling a story about Camille's apartment renovation, and at some point in the story she mentioned the cost of custom kitchen cabinets. And Patrick said something about the housing market in Lincoln Park, and Leonard, making polite conversation the way you'd do at other people's dinner parties, turned toward my end of the table and asked, "And what part of Ohio are you based in?" I said Columbus. He nodded slowly. "Columbus. You said e-commerce. What category?" I said grocery and general merchandise, mostly third-party logistics still. He stopped nodding. His eyes sharpened slightly. Third-party logistics, regional or national, Ohio, Indiana, some Kentucky, expanding into Michigan this year. Grocery specifically, who are some of your accounts if you don't mind me asking? I listed 3. Hartwell was the second one I mentioned. Leonard set his fork down. Not dramatically, very quietly, the way a person does when they need their hands free to think. "Hartwell Family Markets," he said. "You're the operation that picked up their volume last spring." I said yes. There was a pause. Aunt Sylvia said something to the woman on her other side. Patrick was still talking to my father. My mother was in the kitchen getting the dessert plates. Leonard looked at me for a long moment and then said, "That account was in genuine crisis. Everyone in the industry was watching to see if it was going to collapse. Someone stepped in and held it together so cleanly that Hartwell's numbers actually went up in Q3. He paused. "That was you," I said yes. He sat back slightly. "What's your annual revenue if that's not too direct?" I told him. He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked down the table at where my father was sitting and back at me and said, "Ted has been telling me all evening about Camille's consulting work." I didn't say anything. He said he didn't mention this. I picked up my wine glass. I said, "He doesn't really know." Leonard looked at me with an expression I could not fully read. It wasn't pity. It wasn't quite surprise. It was something more considered than either of those things, the expression of a man who has spent 40 years in business watching people underestimate supply chains and is very used to what that costs. My mother came back from the kitchen with the dessert plates, and she set one in front of me with the particular efficiency of a woman who has decided that dinner parties mean she is always slightly in motion, and she said to Leonard, "I hope she hasn't been talking your ear off about her little eBay thing." And she laughed, and it was the kind of laugh that means something isn't really a joke but the speaker wants the cover of it being one. Leonard turned to her. He said, not unkindly but without any softness, "Your daughter runs a third-party logistics operation with accounts across 3 states. She saved Hartwell Family Markets from a distribution collapse that the whole industry was watching." He picked up his dessert fork. "That's not a little eBay thing." My mother blinked. The table had gone quiet. I don't know if everyone heard or if just the people nearby heard, or if the specific silence was just the natural pause between one conversational thread and another, but it was quiet. Camille looked at me. I couldn't read her expression either. Patrick was looking at Leonard with the particular attention of a man who has learned to track where power sits in any room. My father said, "Well," and then didn't say anything else. My mother sat down. She picked up her own fork. She did not look at me directly. I ate my dessert. It was a lemon tart from the bakery 2 streets over, the same one my mother had been ordering from for 20 years. It was very good. At the end of the evening, Leonard found me in the entryway while I was getting my coat. He handed me his card. His personal card, not a business card. He was retired, he had no business cards, just a cream-colored card with his name and a phone number and an email's address. He said, "I still sit on 2 advisory boards. One of them is actively looking for an operations consultant for a regional distribution expansion in the Midwest. I'd like to put your name forward if you're open to it." He paused. "That's not charity. I watched what you did with Hartwell. I know what that took." I took the card. I said, "Thank you." He said, "No, thank you. You kept 17 stores stocked for the holidays. That matters to a lot of people who never know your name." He shook my hand and said goodnight to my parents and left. I put on my coat. Camille was nearby, and she said, quietly, "I didn't know about any of it." I said, "I know." She said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was layered, and probably needed more than an entryway and a coat, and the sound of her boyfriend Patrick saying his goodbyes to my father. So I just said, "Nobody asked." She looked at me with something that was either guilt or the beginning of understanding. Maybe both. I didn't push it. My mother appeared from the kitchen to say goodbye the way she always does right before you leave, arriving with the precise timing of someone who has remembered at the last minute that a moment is happening. She hugged me. She said, "The drive is long, text when you get home." I said I would. My father walked me to the door. He looked like he was searching for something to say, the way he sometimes gets when the architecture of a situation has shifted and he hasn't yet adjusted to the new layout. He said, "Your mother means well." I said, "I know." He said, "We didn't realize." I said, "I know, Dad." I said it gently because I did know. Ignorance isn't always cruelty. Sometimes people just stop looking and they tell themselves it's because there's nothing to see. I drove 3 hours back to Columbus in the dark, past the interstate exits I'd been taking for years, past the business park where my first warehouse was, past the new facility we'd broken ground on in March that was twice the size. The radio played quietly. The highway was mostly empty. I thought about Leonard's card in my coat pocket, about the Hartwell account, about 3 years of 4 a.m. mornings and a living room full of boxes and a label printer on a kitchen table, about a graduation card with a $20 bill. I thought about how the truth has a way of surfacing on its own timeline, not yours. You can spend years building something in the quiet, and eventually the thing you built becomes too real to ignore. Not because you announced it, not because you fought for recognition, but because it grew large enough that someone important walked into a dinner party and recognized it from across the table. I called Garrett the next morning. I told him to flag my name for the Midwest distribution project Leonard had mentioned. He said he already knew about it. It was a significant contract. He was glad I was interested. I said I was interested. Then I opened my laptop and went to work, the way I do every morning, in the quiet before anyone is paying attention, which is where most of the real things get built.